Mamdani is at about 45%, and he's been in that territory for a few weeks now, whereas Andrew Cuomo is in the low 30s at 31%. So you're talking about a 14-point margin, at least in our polling average.
I think the main big question is whether Mamdani can crack 50% of the vote. It's somewhat of a symbolic number, but it kind of isn't at the same time. But Cuomo is not only disliked by a large number of Democrats, he's disliked by a large number of Republicans.
Welcome to the Decision Desk HQ podcast. I'm Jeffrey Skelly, your host, the Chief Elections Analyst at Decision Desk HQ. Ahead of Election Day, we've already covered two statewide contests, New Jersey and Virginia. There are three in Virginia, actually, that we went over the past two podcasts. But there is another very high-profile office on the ballot next week, and that's New York City's mayor. Voters in the nation's largest city are set to elect their next leader in a race that has sparked major debates within the Democratic Party in the aftermath of its 2024 presidential defeat. The big story here is the rise of Assemblymember Zohran Mamdani, a self-identified Democratic socialist who upset former Governor Andrew Cuomo in the June Democratic primary. But while New York City is quite blue, the primary was not the end of the story because Cuomo remained in the race running on an independent ballot line. So the general election is essentially a contest between Mamdani and Cuomo with a Republican on the ballot, Curtis Sliwa, running in third place. There have been a lot of twists and turns, including Mamdani's win and also incumbent Mayor Eric Adams' decision to drop out toward the end of September. And so to talk about this volatile race that's gotten so much attention, understandably, I'm excited to welcome Michael Lange onto the podcast. Michael, thanks so much for being here. Michael is a writer, researcher, strategist, and political organizer who is a born and raised New Yorker. He has a Substack you should check out, The Narrative Wars. He's written a bunch of really engaging articles on the politics of New York, current and past, and many really helpful analyses of what's been going on in this current race, whether you're thinking about the primary or the general election. And I think, one thing that people would probably notice or find notable is that he put together a really good analysis of the June primary vote between Mamdani and Cuomo and some other candidates, but mainly those two, in the New York Times that broke down how the different constituencies around the city supported Mamdani or Cuomo. So, Michael, again, thank you so much for joining me to talk about the Big Apple.
Oh, the pleasure's all mine. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, I felt like, from the get-go in this election cycle, we're going to talk a lot about the governor's races in Virginia and New Jersey and the New York City mayor. And now California has added in this redistricting proposition that is getting a lot of attention. But, the New York City mayoral race has been at the top of the charts from the get-go. So, and I thought just to start out, it would be helpful to maybe set the scene for viewers and listeners, by talking about where the race stands, sort of how he got to this point. And then I'd really love to hear you go into some of your thoughts about what could play into the final result. Cuomo's efforts to win over some Republican-leaning voters who might otherwise support Sliwa, Mamdani's efforts to turn out his base, and also how I think you've had some stats that I want to get into about sort of your early, rough projections for turnout and how it does look like this is going to be a much higher turnout general election than we've seen in a while in New York, probably because it's been comparatively competitive and interesting. So I guess just start out with just a few days to go here. What do you think of the contest at this point?
I think for as much as Andrew Cuomo wants to say he's kind of making a push and kind of narrowing Zohran Mamdani's lead, I think the main big question is whether Mamdani can crack 50% of the vote. That is, it's somewhat of a symbolic number, but it kind of isn't at the same time, right? Running in a 3-candidate race, if he can get a majority, it's very, I would say he can take that as indicative of a mandate from the voters. Whereas if he, finished below 50% and Cuomo was within 10% of him or so, then many people would charge, if Curtis Sliwa wasn't in the race, Zohran wouldn't have won to begin with. It would kind of, after the high of June where he won the primary by 13%, it would very much kind of leave him lacking momentum even before he took office. So I think I think the big question is kind of, can he get a majority, and less so in terms of the ultimate win-loss outcome.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I just shared on screen here for people watching the polling average that Decision Desk HQ has for the New York City mayoral race. And in our average right now, Mamdani is at about 45%, and he's been in that territory for a few weeks now, whereas Andrew Cuomo is in the low 30s at 31%. So you're talking about a 14-point margin, at least in our polling average. And then down in third place is Curtis Sliwa, the Republican nominee, who is at about 16%. And so, I mean, I think that gets at some of the fundamentals you were just mentioning there, and thinking about, okay, a few polls have had Mamdani break that 50% mark. Most of them have had him in the mid to high 40s. And Cuomo has inched up into the low to mid 30s in some polls, which again speaks to the fact that the race is probably not really too much in doubt, barring some pretty dramatic shifts from what we've seen here. But I am curious for your thoughts about sort of Cuomo's efforts to win over Republican voters and the pressure that he attempted to put on Curtis Sliwa, and Curtis Sliwa's reaction to the idea of dropping out.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question. So when Andrew Cuomo kind of began his career, kind of over 20 years ago, and when he first ran for governor and many other things, he very much was like a centrist Democrat, and kind of over his decade-long tenure as governor, he more transitioned to being like, oh, I'm a pragmatic progressive. He signed a bunch of bail reform laws, changes to the law into law in the state legislature. There was obviously his handling of COVID, much maligned towards the end. So, and Cuomo's like, he's an Italian Catholic outer borough Democrat. He's someone that at many points in his career, he did have, meaningful crossover support from Republicans and independents. But even before he resigned from office, you kind of saw some of that start to erode. But now he's kind of trying to get back to his roots in terms of, again, courting more conservative voters, courting Republicans, things like that. But he's the person kind of in his way is Curtis Sliwa, who famously wears a red beret around, although he takes it off for the televised debates and whatnot. But Curtis Sliwa founded the Guardian Angels in the 1980s. It was like a subway ridership vigilante group where they would wear all red, and they would kind of, make sure that people were safe or felt protected, et cetera, et cetera. So people like Curtis Sliwa. He's been a kind of a mainstay of talk radio for a long time. But Cuomo, as Cuomo does, he kind of likes to try and push people out. He's very used to getting his way, even though he has no power anymore, kind of has that bully persona. But with Curtis Sliwa, he's kind of met his match. And in his, he's certainly tried to cast Sliwa as a spoiler, which is frankly true. Curtis Sliwa has no chance of winning. But Cuomo is not only disliked by a large number of Democrats, he's disliked by a large number of Republicans. And kind of that ancestral white ethnic, like Italian, Irish, New York Democrat, New York Republican, that kind of used to be a really big part of the city's political tapestry, and then is kind of slowly dwindling by the years. There's not that much love lost between them and Andrew Cuomo anymore. So he's kind of in this desperate plea where he's trying to hold on to the Democrats that he still has while really making this push for Republicans. And as you can see from your polling average, Sliwa has hovered around kind of the mid-teens relatively consistently. Cuomo's the one who benefited most from Eric Adams dropping out. But in order for this to become any, competitive in any which way, you would need Sliwa's support to be far more marginalized. You would need him to kind of get down to 10 or under, I would say.
Yeah, and I guess it's also worth mentioning that it's not guaranteed, to your point about Republicans being not the biggest fans of Andrew Cuomo. It's no guarantee that suddenly that you could just add that 16, to Cuomo's 31 by any means. And I think there's sometimes a little bit of an assumption of that. I mean, for instance, in a recent poll from Suffolk University, I think they said something like 40% of Sliwa's voters named Cuomo as a second choice, and like 2% named Mamdani. But that means almost 60% didn't name one of those two as their second choice or a second choice at all. And so that would probably speak to a situation where at least a sizable chunk of them would not show up in a true head-to-head matchup.
Yeah, there's no doubt that a true head-to-head would be more competitive than the race that we currently have. But also, for as many people talk about Zohran Mamdani's ceiling and what that is, Andrew Cuomo, as he found out in the primary, has a pretty hard ceiling. In that, I do think he is getting some type of boost from people who are not Democrats voting for him now. But generally, Cuomo, again, with someone who has a pretty firm ceiling, higher turnout does not automatically benefit him. And we saw that the best way to kind of beat Cuomo that in the primary was, he had a very high floor. He led basically until the last couple days, was someone who could kind of expand the electorate beyond kind of, engage non-traditional voters. That if you had, like a very cookie cutter set of candidates, and then, and some other, and other New Yorkers weren't necessarily engaged, that Cuomo was going to be in a very strong position. But Mamdani was able to do that. There were 940,000 people who voted in 2021. There were 1.07 million folks who voted this time, and it was skewed. And for as many, Mamdani added hundreds of thousands of voters, and Cuomo also had tens of thousands of people who voted for Eric Adams stay home this time around. So, yeah.
Getting to your point, you were mentioning that Cuomo is not very popular. Well, I'll get to his in a second. But we also have polling averages for the favorability ratings of these candidates. And I think, overall, Mamdani is hung around 50%, not too dissimilar, obviously, from his overall support in favorability polling throughout. And he is the only candidate who has been net positive during this time. So, that could speak to a lot of things about Mamdani's appeal, the fact that he's a fresh face, the fact that how he's, appealing to voters. But to me, it's been such a clear distinction between him and Cuomo in particular. I'll bring up, so I have Mamdani's up there right now. He's at 48% favorable and about 38% unfavorable in our average right now. And if you look at Cuomo's numbers have improved a little bit, but he's still underwater, which is to say his favorability is at about 43% in our polling average, and his unfavorability is at about 48%. And if that's the best you've been doing basically throughout the campaign, that would speak to some inherent problems, perhaps, with your ability to appeal. And obviously, people are so familiar with Andrew Cuomo, so familiar with his record as governor, and that's for him, for better or for worse. And so, sort of getting at what you were talking about, I thought it was helpful for people to put some numbers to sort of Cuomo's standing. I don't know if there's anything you'd like to add on that one.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that, I'm someone who sings Zohran Mamdani's praises frequently. I think he's an exceptional campaigner. I think what he's accomplished is truly remarkable. But that being said, if he had a non-Andrew Cuomo opponent, I think this race would be a lot closer, frankly. And that for as generational a candidate as Mamdani is, Cuomo was almost equally flawed and kind of capped. People just, Democrats, Republicans, and independents, most people don't like him. I mean, even amongst the support that he is garnering in these polls, over half of his coalition is basically people saying, I don't want Mamdani. He's the only other person I can vote for. So,
yeah, that puts you in a tough spot for expanding support because you need people to go and proactively cast the ballot for you. Now, I do think sometimes we overrate how difficult that is, but for the average voter. But at the same time, you are talking about a race where 35% of registered voters might vote, something in that range, and that would be high for a recent New York mayoral general election. And so at the end of the day, there's just a lot of lower propensity voters who are not going to participate in this. So if you're looking to expand the electorate and you don't have sort of a new type of appeal like Mamdani and your old hat like Cuomo, that gets a little tougher. I just want to share this because I think this gets to your sort of the general point that you were saying there of Mamdani, politics, a lot is about timing. And so when are you running and what conditions are you running under and who are you running against? And so he's running against Cuomo, who's underwater in favorability. So you've got so that's Andrew Cuomo's favorability rating. I think I may have forgotten to bring that up earlier. So let me just put that up again. He's underwater, higher unfavorable than favorable rating, 48% unfavorable, 43% favorable. Curtis Sliwa, also well underwater. I mean, he is a Republican in New York. That's kind of tough. I mean, a lot of people don't have an opinion of him. But in that sense, it's gonna be tough for him. And then one of my favorite charts of this entire election has been Eric Adams's favorability, where I'm not sure he could get elected dog catcher because this is the incumbent mayor of New York City. Yeah. His favorability has been hovering in like the mid-20s for a while. And so, he ended up dropping out of the race. He didn't seek the Democratic nomination back in the primary. He was trying to run a third-party bid. And so it's just thinking about these as sort of the three most notable figures that Mamdani's running against that I think has played to his advantage, as you pointed out.
For sure. And also once, in the Democratic primary, there was a relatively credible group of non-Cuomo candidates, but Zohran was just a far more skilled campaigner. He understood how to garner attention. He had really close ties to a lot of the grassroots organizations in the city that were activating young voters, activating lower propensity voters. And he just had a good team and they very much executed. But if his chief opponent was someone less offensive than Cuomo, I still think he would have won. Like if he would have had to run against Brad Lange or Adrian Adams or Zohran Mamdani or something, I think he still would have won. But someone like a Westmore type would have been tricky for Zohran, kind of based on the demographics and the coalition of the city. What is working in his advantage, though, is that his voters, young voters, South Asian voters, Muslim voters, these are all like demographics in the city that are growing significantly. So, one of the things I said was that his coalition is not only here to stay, it's growing by the day. And you see that now, even given he's the Democratic nominee, his support in Black and Hispanic communities in the city has steadily increased, So I think a lot of the coalitions that most dislike Zohran, other than like Orthodox and Hasidic Jews, their numbers, their share of the electorate in the city is like decreasing. Older wealthy voters, white ethnic voters, older Black voters, right? These are people who are leaving the city or just kind of with age leaving the electorate as a whole. Yeah.
I wanted to talk a little bit about turnout in this election because New York City hasn't had a competitive general election for mayor in quite some time. I think it was since Michael Bloomberg's first bid.
16 years, 2009.
Yeah, that they really had a close race. So it's been a while and a lot has obviously happened since then. But I was curious for your thoughts on, because I think actually even in some of those races, there weren't necessarily turnout wasn't necessarily that high. And again, this is all relative here because high turnout in an off year mayoral election versus turnout, say, a presidential election are two very different beasts. But for a mayoral election, at least in terms of raw numbers of voters and even the percentage of registered voters in recent elections, you had some stats you tweeted out the other day where you sort of looked at or yesterday, I should say. I'm going to share this now, but I've highlighted it. You sort of using the sort of pace of returns for early voting and thinking about turnout. You were kind of at a number of about 1.7 million for general, basing it off the 2024 general pace, and then off the 2025 primary be a lot higher, like 2.4. This is like the total number of people voting. And so if you're thinking, we talked a little bit before we started recording about sort of what that means to you, but I thought I wanted you to sort of put those numbers in context for people because this would be pretty high turnout for a recent New York City mayoral election.
Yeah. So I kind of paced those out based on the early voting, like where we were at in terms of the percentage of the total electorate, both 4 days into the Democratic primary and then 4 days into the general election last November. New York has only had early voting for a few years, and it's really only come into its own as like as a huge part, as like a thing where 1/3 of people vote early kind of in the last 12 months. So I didn't want to go back any further because I didn't really see the point. I would imagine that we surpass 1.75 million votes total in this election. I think we could go as high as 2 million. 2 million does feel like kind of a stretch, so I think I kind of want to be a little safer. And that is, New York City has not seen that much participation in a mayoral election since 1993, which was a very bitter rematch between David Dinkins, who was the black incumbent, and Rudy Giuliani, who went on to narrowly defeat Dinkins and then was mayor for 2 terms, ran for president, became a crank, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it speaks, and, we had a pretty high turnout year in 2001. It was after September 11th, Michael Bloomberg versus Mark Green, kind of like a battle of white ethnic New York, you could say. But I think it not only speaks to the, the higher turnout that we're seeing, it speaks to the competitiveness of this race, but also just the national political environment, particularly. It'll be 11 months, or it'll be a year to the day since Donald Trump won. And people are very engaged. They're looking to do things. I think a huge part of the Mamdani victory in the story is kind of that counter to Trump and people looking for someone who does things differently, who is a little more, I would say, combative with the opposition, but also kind of the establishment, the desire for people seeking change, things of that nature. And so also the kind of the blue wave anti-Trump bump, that should be most pronounced in many of the areas that Zohran Mamdani does well. So I think that bodes favorably for him submitting a very strong showing in the general.
Yeah, he, I've brought up a table here actually of sort of the recent mayoral elections in New York City, the percentage won by the winner, and then the actual total number of citywide votes. And as you were pointing out, to be clear, like the denominator in terms of the people living in New York City has changed somewhat over time. But broadly speaking, as you said, the last time we saw participation at sort of levels we're talking about in this election was back in the David Dinkins, Rudy Giuliani battles of 1989 and 1993. And even in some closer elections since then, like ones involving Mike Bloomberg in 2001 and 2009, we have not seen that degree of participation. And I think actually I had some numbers. I didn't have it in a chart, but I looked up sort of the and as you noted that New York City's only had early voting for a few years now, and similarly rules about registration and how active, inactive, how things are recorded has not necessarily been perfectly the same over time. So you don't want to do too much in the way of an apples to oranges comparison. But I did think it was interesting that essentially in 2009, this is how far back the data I collected went to, in that election, about 28% of registered voters turned out for the general election. If you're talking about the kind of numbers you're saying, I mean, that might be as high as 38% in this election, just based on data from earlier in the year in New York City or something in that vicinity. So that would obviously be and if 2009 was the highest percentage of sort of the last 4 elections, and you're talking about it not quite doubling, but nearly, that does seem to say something about sort of the levels of engagement, the levels of intensity. And it does seem like it is sort of a perfect mix of both local, national, and even international, given in chatter about Mamdani's position and Cuomo's position about subjects like Israel and Palestine and what's been going on in Gaza. And so you really end up with this really remarkable mix of factors that could play into. And if the race were even closer, if we had polls showing it was 44, 43 or something, that turnout could be even higher.
Right. I think so. I'm 26 years old. So in 2009, I was 10, but some of my elder millennial friends, they do kind of share stories about what 2009 was like. The polls were, they all showed Bloomberg ahead of Bill Thompson, who was the city controller at the time. They showed Bloomberg up like between 15 and 20 points. And then Bloomberg only won by 3%. And it was Bloomberg's third term. He had very controversially lobbied the city council for a term limits extension. And there was a lot of fatigue with his coalition, and it allowed Bill Thompson to outshoot the polls significantly because turnout really like cratered. I think Bloomberg got significantly fewer votes than he did just 4 years earlier. It was just that the Democrats, they got like the same number that they did 4 years ago. So it was just exhausted time. It was right after 2008. But there wasn't, national politics hadn't really pierced New York City. I think this was still like a very local dominated place until 2016, 2018. That's when it all really started to kind of come together, and you have the nationwide progressive movement really finding, I would say, its epicenter here in the city, the socialist left, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, obviously figures like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the DSA's growth in New York City. I think this is a good opportunity to talk a little bit about, we've got like just a few minutes here left. I don't want to keep you too long. But I thought it'd be cool to talk a little bit about something you just published on your Substack, The Narrative Wars, about sort of the neighborhoods the constituencies of New York City. And we don't have to dig into all the facets of this because there's a lot here, but I didn't know I think a lot of people coming out of this election, out of the primary election, have maybe heard the term commie corridor pop up. I think, that, and then talking about sort of, I think particularly thinking about voters of color who are of South Asian descent, or groups that Mamdani has broken through with, that maybe were in areas where Trump did better, comparatively better in 2024 than he did in 2020. I didn't know if you had some thoughts about that you thought were worth sharing.
Yeah, I mean, so the commie corridor now has taken on a life of its own. I remember that was just something, I am a member of DSA. There was something we used to just like pinball around in like chats, and it was like a little shorthand, and now it's, after that article I wrote in the New York Times, it's like everywhere. So yeah, this is the map. I broke it down into commie corridor, senior versus junior, right? Senior is like the areas where it's like, okay, this has been going on for a long time. This is like this is the anchor of the commie corridor, the OG, you could say. But then Zohran showed that, hey, the commie corridor is like bigger, and it's growing, and it's young, and it is gentrifying. But like in the next 5 to 10 years, some of these areas will be represented by Democratic Socialists or other progressives. The next Mamdani might represent one of these areas. So you kind of see that dark purple on the map, and then you see the lighter purple for junior, which extends in further into central Brooklyn, to Bay Ridge, to the East Village, to parts of Upper Manhattan. We also, we have some other fun color coding on this map, right? If I can make fun of the socialists, I can also make fun of Archie Bunker's descendants, which are in red. Archie Bunker was Queens homeowner from All in the Family. He was kind of, the embodiment of, the urban Catholic white working class man, right? And in New York City, those folks are now largely Republican. The areas where Trump did very well, some of the lighter shades of like pink, I would say, are the anti-commie corridor, right? These are the areas where it's like the counter to what's going on. There are areas where Cuomo did very well, where Trump did very well. A lot of Eastern European immigrants who decidedly hate socialism. And then also New York, amongst kind of the affluent Manhattan, very civically engaged electorate. You have interesting kind of delineations there as well, like in Park Slope. Those folks across all ages, they're very progressive despite their wealth, whereas in other parts of Manhattan, it's a little more straight line liberal Democrat. These are places that were very split in the primary, but will probably just go with Mamdani because he's the nominee. But then also in the city's wealthiest areas, I'm talking about like Fifth Avenue, Madison Avenue, Park Avenue, etc. I call that the capitalist corridor, because that is kind of the center of this failed Zohran Mamdani resistance. Like your Bill Ackmans, when they come into the city, they hang out there. So yeah, this was a map I just published. I encourage folks to check out the piece. It's about how Zohran Mamdani can get to that 50% that we've been discussing here.
Yeah, and I think, getting back to sort of just some of the numbers here, just to close out, thinking about, back in August, I wrote just kind of a general overview piece of where things stood in the New York mayoral race. And just using that 28% turnout figure from 2009, I was getting about 1.3 million people turning out. And, that alone was going to put Mamdani at about 43% just based on his primary vote. Most of the people who voted in the primary for Zohran Mamdani are going to vote for him in the general election. Is just a fundamental baseline, right? And so if he's at 43%, just based on that's pretty significant. Now, if that number is more like 1.8 million, that is certainly less. That puts Mamdani sort of based off his primary voters' support at about a third, roughly. And so that means he does need to add on more of these general election voters who may not have turned out for the primary. And I guess I would say that would be a potential weakness for him, except at the same time, he still is leading in the polls in terms of the general electorate. And maybe that gets back to some of the weaknesses that we talked about with Cuomo or Sliwa, for that matter, that, some of those, and I should note that some of those general election voters are Republicans who will probably, many of them will vote for Sliwa. And so they were harder to account for because Sliwa was unopposed in the Republican primary.
Yeah, I mean, some of the data that the Board of Elections has very kindly shared publicly shows that, the electorate is older now than it was in the primary, but that's certainly to be expected. And, of course, Cuomo, they try and champion that as a great boon to them and a backlash to Mamdani. And, I guess I understand why they do it, but also a large chunk of almost all of Curtis Sliwa's voters comes from folks who are over 50 years old. The Republican coalition in New York, Trump made some momentary gains with lower propensity voters, but the off-year Republican coalition in New York is extremely old. And I also predict that, generally older voters, they like to vote earlier during this early voting period. Halloween is Friday. The New York City Marathon's on Sunday. I think a lot of, I haven't voted yet. A lot of my peers have not voted yet. I think there's going to be a huge kind of surge over the weekend and on Halloween, which is similar to kind of dynamics that we saw last time. And then also now the Mamdani coalition in the general election is more working class, even more diverse than it was in the primary. That should help his performance on election day when the polls are open from 6 a.m. to 9 p.m.
Well, Michael Lange, this was really helpful, I think, for sort of digging into some of what we've seen in the contest up to this point. Sort of, the outlook is certainly likely Mamdani, I would say, based on what we know about the polls at this point, what we know about Andrew Cuomo's favorability. But I think it's still worth talking about, because obviously if Mamdani wins, he will be this very important national figure. He will be getting lots of attention moving ahead. And obviously Democrats are going to continue to debate over, talking about someone like Cuomo having been sort of a centrist and then center left politician, and then Mamdani obviously coming from the left. Sort of where the party goes from here, what sort of appeals work with voters, and obviously where they're running could also play a big role in that, in terms of whether or not those appeals can work. So this, I think, was a really good primer for understanding sort of where things are in New York City. So I really appreciate you taking the time to come on and talk with me about it.
Oh, pleasure is all mine. Thank you for having me.
And again, that's Michael Lange. He's a writer and researcher very focused on New York City politics. He has a Substack, The Narrative Wars, with a lot of interesting stuff. I enjoyed a piece he wrote recently on City Island, which is a thing that as a non-New Yorker, I was basically ignorant of, but is a very interesting little neighborhood in New York City that is super fascinating. So I encourage people to go check that out. And
thank you for reading that, by the way.
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
it's very local. It's a very local thing, but I'm glad it can be exciting to even people who might not have the pleasure of going.
Oh, I think it's really interesting. I was like, man, next time I go to New York City, maybe I gotta go make a trek to City Island. So.
You got to 100%.
Michael, thank you so much for coming on and talking with us on the Decision Desk HQ podcast.
Thanks for having me.